Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
He is the man in charge. There is no competition.
He's one of the most enigmatic leaders in the world and one of the most powerful. Join me for a conversation about Vladimir Putin with journalist Jill Dougherty, who covered Russia for several decades at CNN and is writing a book about Putin. That's Dialogue next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. There was a time in this country that many Americans still remember when the Soviet Union and the United States were close to war. Indeed, there was a nuclear fallout shelter just a few hundred feet from this studio. This area was especially on guard in the early 1960s because 3 Titan I missile bases were close by. It's now been 25 years since the Soviet Union crumbled, but the Russian Federation is still a force to be reckoned with, as is its inscrutable and unpredictable leader, Vladimir Putin. One of the few American journalists who has covered Putin and Russia extensively joins me now to talk about Putin's persona and his policies and how they could affect the United States. Jill Dougherty had a 30-year career at CNN, most recently as its foreign affairs correspondent. She was also the White House correspondent and the Moscow bureau chief during her tenure at the network. Fluent in Russian, Dougherty left CNN in 2013 to get a master's degree in international relations from Georgetown University. She's currently a global fellow at the Kennan Institute, part of the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. And she's writing a book based on her master's thesis, delving into Putin's soft power tactics and how he's creating a whole new ideology for his country. Now, Dougherty was in Boise to speak to the Boise Committee on Foreign Relations, and we thank that group for sharing her with us. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Marcia. I'm very glad to be here.
And I'm going to try what's left of my rudimentary Russian from college and say Здравствуйте. Как вы поживаете?
Очень хорошо. Спасибо, я очень рада, что я здесь с вами и что вы говорите по-русски.
Well, thank you, I guess. It's a hard language, but it's a beautiful language. It's a beautiful culture and fascinating history and literature. I just loved what I studied in college. You yourself have been involved and fascinated with what was then the Soviet Union, now Russia, since you were just a teenager.
Yeah, about 13, freshman in high school. And I have a twin sister, and we went to a school in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And it was a very good high school, public high school, and I am deplorable at math, so I eliminated that, and you had to take a major in my high school, math or languages. And I thought, forget math, I'll do languages. And when you do languages, you have to do a modern language and Latin. So I thought, interesting, Cold War, Russian. My father was in the FBI, so I thought, well, know the enemy. And then, Pam and I just started studying Russian. We had a fantastic teacher who, in the 4th year, gave us his free period to allow us to continue studying Russian. And then, it gave me my career because we ended up in Leningrad studying, and, it's something that I've been deeply interested in for a very long time.
And you ended up in Leningrad, as you said. The person that you are now focusing your attention on, Vladimir Putin, was in Leningrad around the same time, or at the same time.
Oddly enough.
You were. Let's talk a little bit about that and what Leningrad means to this man. Those of us who studied history know about the siege of Leningrad. His family knew it intimately. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the blockade. His mother nearly died. His brother did die.
Yes.
So this is something that's important to know about Putin, isn't it? That he's formed by Leningrad and the siege of Leningrad.
Absolutely. I mean, Leningrad, as we know, went through the Nazi blockade, and there are some fantastic books. One of the best, of course, is The 900 Days. And it was a horrible, horrible experience. The Nazis cut the city off and tried to starve it to death. And people literally did die from starvation, and they also died from the cold. And it was a terrible experience. His mother collapsed from hunger. She gave her food portion, because they had a little tiny piece of, bread, to her husband, and collapsed from hunger. They almost took her off to a common grave, but she survived. Somebody noticed that she was alive.
Was Putin alive at the time?
Putin was not born.
So he might not have been born.
No, he wasn't born at that time.
If she had not been saved.
Absolutely correct. And, when you think of Putin and those experiences, my understanding of what he probably went through was that in his mind he said, this is never going to happen again. Russia will never be weak enough to have another Leningrad.
You feel we're seeing a resurgent Russia, a resurgent Putin, and that he has an ideology that must be understood.
He is the man in charge. There is no competition. There is no, basically, the opposition exists, but they are weak. And so he is the man who runs that country.
And he's got his fingers in a lot of things in the world right now.
Absolutely.
Syria, for one. As we sit here and talk, there's been a ceasefire announced. He's intimately involved in Syria. He's a player. He has been also intimately tied with our elections this year.
Who would have thought?
Whether it's cyber attacks into the DNC and other entities, or the fear that he could, and his people could wreak havoc with the election cycle, so with the voting. So he is a player in lots of ways now.
He wants to, I think, have a seat at the table at any international issue that is going on right now. So recently we've seen him moving in the Middle East to become the peacemaker. He has brought together the Israelis and the Palestinians. Russia was a big part, and actually a good part, of the solution of the Iranian nuclear program that President Obama worked for as well. So they were a good player in that role. They have some influence, not as much as China, but they have some influence in North Korea. You can name a lot of different areas where he has a role, and as soon as he perceives that he has some type of influence, he immediately expands that. So I think that's where the Middle East is really becoming very noticeable, that they're back in that Middle East equation very strongly.
Should we fear Putin as Americans?
Fear, let's figure out what kind of word we use. I think we should be cautious about Putin. I don't think we should fear him unless, I don't think he would ever do this, but unless he just decided to press the button and launch missiles. And he's not about to do that, I think. It's ridiculous to think. But what he is doing, to be cautious, to realize that when the United States pulls back or is not taking the lead or very energetic in international policy and affairs, Putin is very savvy at getting in there and playing a role and maximizing what Russia can do. So he will be a player, and it's going to be either sometimes it's a good player, witness Iran. Sometimes it's a player like in Syria, where he creates certain difficulties for us at the same time that he says he wants to work together. And so it becomes very difficult for the United States to react and to know what to do. I also think that you could say that he is a malevolent player in things like Ukraine, Crimea, and some of the borders of the former, let's say, Russia and the republics that used to be part of the Soviet Union. His border is very important. It's almost like a Leningrad moment. They shall not get close to Russia, the enemy, that is, which would be NATO. So he is intent on not necessarily taking over countries of the former Soviet Union, but having enormous influence in them economically, politically, and sometimes militarily.
Is it true, the stereotype, that Russians have to have some sort of strong man running them, whether it's a czar or a dictator?
Oh, you know, I know that debate is always part of it. I hate to always say that people, you know, genetically are born, but I would say that it's more collective mentality for a lot of people. That said, Russians can be very, very individualistic. But traditionally, historically, and I would say among the common people, the masses right now, they do tend to think that they need somebody to bring them together. And the reason they say that, which is interesting, they have the idea that without some type of control, they'll kind of go crazy. And it's odd, but they do feel sometimes, gross generalization, but I think it's partially true, that Russians feel that they have to be corralled because otherwise they can get into real trouble at home. And I would also, Marcia, I'd say one other thing that has crept most recently into that idea of Russians and who we are is moral superiority. It doesn't sound that important, but in Russia the context is really important, that Russia is morally superior to the West. The West, the United States, Western Europe, are corrupt, debauched in the way we act, the way we dress, gay marriage, rights for minorities that shouldn't be protected, and you know, that moral superiority is a big part of the appeal that he has.
So what do you consider Putin's soft power, and why was it so intriguing to you to spend time writing your master's thesis and now a book on it?
Because I think that the way the world works now is, of course, we have military conflicts, etc. But a lot of how nations relate to each other is soft power. It's cultural attraction. If you get another country to like you, you can begin to exert influence. In the early days of Russia, the modern Russia, they realized that they had very little soft power. What were they perceived as? Crime, the mafia, you know, oligarchs, etc. It was not a good picture. And in fact, if you look at the polls, Russia was way down on attraction to other countries. So I think they would love to have the influence that the United States has, even with all its faults. The United States has a lot of soft power, culture, music, and also way of life, you know? So what did they do? They quickly realized that they didn't have a lot of way of influencing people around the world culturally, and they also didn't have the tools for it. Their PR, propaganda organs had kind of died and were underfunded. So I would say that what they've done is they've taken an opposite tack, which is they attack and criticize the United States and engender in people the idea that everybody in the world lies. The United States is lying. Everybody, all countries lie. Therefore, you shouldn't really believe anything that the Americans say, and you should be cautious about their actions and all of this. In other words, destroy what you can of the influence of the United States, and maybe that's enough, because they can't overwhelm it with their own culture at this point, their soft power. So just destroy Americans. I should say Americans' influence.
And you do that through the internet.
The web, the internet, Russian propaganda.
So when people look at Facebook and the internet, they should be aware, shouldn't they, that some sites, many comments that they read are actually Russian trolls.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there is a famous, infamous troll factory in St. Petersburg, where people sit there, young guys primarily, and they're paid to troll the web, look at the web, see anyone who's, let's say, criticizing Russia or criticizing Putin, and go after them.
Or go after one of our political
Absolutely.
people.
They can criticize Obama, and some of the things that are out there are really disgusting.
But it may not look like a Russian site.
No.
And it may not look like a Russian name.
Exactly. In fact, usually it's like a, you know, Jim Jones from, I don't know, Dubuque, Iowa. But it's not, because he actually doesn't exist.
How involved do you think that Putin and his people are in trying to spoil or rig this upcoming election?
As I am not an expert in this, but my idea would be, the way I understand it, Russian cyber, let's say, cyber warfare, or a collection of information that goes way back to World War II and before, they've always collected information because information is very powerful. You know, you can blackmail people with information, or you can use it for military purposes. So they've always collected information. Now, the hacking of the DNC is more modern because they have some of the best hackers in the world. Russian hackers are really good. Some of them freelance or are hired by, let's say, oligarchs or corrupt people. Others work for the government, and their job is just to go out and vacuum up as much information as you can. Now, what happens to that information? In many cases, when the government gets it, they put it aside, categorize it, and save it for the magic moment when it will be useful. If it's blackmail, it might be years down the road. If it's military information, they might use it to undermine a country. But I think the nexus between who released it is the most interesting. As far as I can tell, this is my opinion based on people that I've spoken to who do know what's going on, I would say the Russians gave it, or Julian Assange got it from the Russians and then decided to release it. So who's saying do that?
Putin has no love lost for Hillary Clinton.
Absolutely. In fact, he directly accuses her of instigating the demonstrations, the anti-government, anti-Putin demonstrations of 2011 and 2012 on the streets of Moscow, when people got up protesting some shenanigans at their elections. And he literally says that Hillary Clinton gave the signal for those demonstrators to get out. And he took it very seriously. He considered it, in essence, a color revolution, the beginning of a revolution against Russian authority. And I can tell you that people in the Kremlin, some, do believe that the United States wants to carry out regime change against Putin.
Is he recruiting Donald Trump the way that his former career as a KGB agent would have that be?
I think you could actually say that in kind of a technical way. I mean, obviously, he knows Donald Trump is not going to become Russian and, you know, join the Kremlin. But in the sense of getting somebody on your side, the way a KGB agent works, and he was a KGB agent, and this was part of his job, which was to establish rapport with a person who might be useful to you, might have information, etc. The way you do that is by making them feel comfortable with you, by attracting them, seducing them in some way. And so I think Putin can be using Donald Trump. He's certainly saying he's a colorful politician, not intelligent. That word was mistranslated, but a colorful politician. He's winning. He has interesting ideas. He wants to be friends with Russia. Who would say no to that? So he's making overtures to Donald Trump. Now, where that leads is another question, what he wants to do with it, because I'm not quite sure they totally understand what Trump would do were he to get in office. They're not clear on that, but they certainly prefer him to Hillary.
So is there a chance that they could infiltrate the election apparatus here on state levels and change, somehow hack into the polling sites?
I think it would be very hard because, you know, the states, each individual state runs elections, but nothing is out of the realm of possibility. I mean, you know, you can hack into systems, electric systems, and change things. You could simply, let's say, have electrical interference or short outs, you know, whatever, in machines that collect votes. There is that possibility, but I don't know whether they actually would do that.
And what do you think Putin's motivation is in Syria. It's very interesting to me to watch. It's almost like the enemy of our enemy is our friend kind of thing, where they can't stand radical Islam. You know, we have issues as well. We're coming together potentially over Syria. But what's the end game for Putin in Syria?
Well, the beginning of the end game was his desire to save President Assad. Assad was going down. And then once they were in there, it became a big advertisement for Russia and its weapons. I mean, remember the early days of that? They had videos of these fantastic weapons that the Russians were using in Syria for the first time. They were actually testing some of their military hardware. And other countries said, wow, that's very cool. I think we will buy some Russian weapons. So it was also an advertisement for Russian power, the ability to project forces much farther than they ever had before, and to use modern weapons, and also to show that the Russian military was back as a cohesive, trained force. And then it also created problems for the United States, because the United States was supporting some of the opposition, but having real difficulty in separating the legitimate opposition from the terrorists. And that is still a problem.
Why should people care about Vladimir Putin and Russia?
I would say that if you look at what he did in Ukraine, and especially in the way they engineered what happened in Crimea, which was, of course, part of Ukraine, and then had an election. Russian forces went in without their insignia, these little green men, and helped to engineer that. And then they had an election, and they said, we want to be a referendum, and they voted to become part of Russia. The way that was done contravened all sorts of agreements that had been worked out by Europe and the United States and Russia after the Cold War ended. In other words, the Russians damaged and undermined the post-war security structure in Europe. And that is a very big deal when you begin to undermine the way things are done. And that is a danger, because it could happen in other places that Russia wants to subvert, weaken, or just kind of make, difficulty for the United States with.
You've said we have to be prepared for some really rocky times with Russia. And I know you've reminded people that although the finger is not on the trigger, so to speak, for nuclear weapons, they still do exist.
They do, and actually the finger very much is, when you think about it. I mean, even though we have had enormous progress on nuclear weapons and agreeing on limiting the number of nuclear weapons, we're down to, the latest agreement is like there are probably 1,500 or so on either side, compared to tens of thousands during the Cold War. That is a great accomplishment. But the problem is they are still on hair trigger alert, pointed at each other. So that if, God forbid, but if there were some sort of, let's say, mistake, where somebody thought that a missile was headed their way and decided to launch, all of us, I mean, the United States, at least in big cities, and I take it Boise was, or maybe still is, a target, in approximately 20 minutes, the East Coast could be destroyed. And that is still a fact. And so to think that this is not a danger, it is a huge danger. And I would say it's even more of a danger because of this animosity that's been created. We are back to enormous animosity, anti-American, and here the Russians don't have a good image either. But the danger of something going awry, planes buzzing our ships, Russian planes coming in, you've seen that video, I'm sure, buzzing our ships, just to kind of give the finger, really, in a diplomatic way, that's what they're doing. What if the United States shot down that plane? What if some young person, decided to launch? They couldn't totally, but all of these possibilities exist of just a mistake, and a mistake coming back and then creating enormous and very dangerous scenarios.
looking into the future, whoever gets elected president in our country, what do you think is the best strategy for that individual to deal with and work with Vladimir Putin?
I think we have to be very sober about what he is doing. I think we have to look at him not emotionally, not in kind of Cold War terms, but try to really understand what is motivating him. He's not completely inscrutable. He is not, he's more like kind of the Wizard of Oz. We really can understand if we try. And I think we have to back up and not get into very juvenile criticism of each other, but to really say to Mr. Putin, we want, we're both important countries in the world. We respect you as a country. We want to work together, but we're going to be very firm in the things that we believe and the partners that we will protect. But now let's work on other things. And I do think, maybe because now I'm living in Seattle and they're kind of practical about relations, I think we ought to have more trade with Russia. We don't have an economic relationship with them. It's really very tiny. And if we had more trade, and I'm not talking about oil, I'm talking about let's maybe jackets that are manufactured someplace, something that is civilian and good and could help small business.
Well, there's really no exchange going on right now. Between students.
Yes, because the Russians, in spite, stopped an exchange program, which would have been fantastic. That doesn't mean that we can't try to have at least some citizen diplomacy. My life was changed by being an exchange student. By going to St. Petersburg, Leningrad at the time, it absolutely changed my life. And I retain a lot of affection for Russia and respect for Russia because of that experience. And if there were more people going back and forth, we might treat them more like a country as opposed to a concept. It's not the Cold War. So I think we have to act that way.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking time to talk about your breadth of experience in Russia. And I look forward to your book coming out, to reading that. And of course, it'll be incredibly intriguing to see what this relationship is between the two countries going forward. Mm-hmm. You've been listening to Jill Dougherty, who covered the White House and foreign affairs at CNN for 30 years. She's writing a book about Russian President Vladimir Putin. For more information, check out the Dialogue website. Just go to idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. For Dialogue, I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho. By the Friends of Idaho Public Television and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.